Nicola Willis has been talking about new revenue measures as a way of balancing the budget, but she doesn't seem to have told anybody what those new revenue measures might be. I don't think you can consider tax policy in isolation. I think there are issues around the fairness of our tax system that more and more people are now seeing and more commentators are commenting on. So, the government overall gets about 70% of its tax revenue through personal income tax. That puts us right at the top end of the OECD in terms of, of that, whereas most other OECD countries have a more diversified tax system. But you can't talk about solutions to that problem without talking about where you see the economy going, where you see government spending going, what your priorities are. All of those things are connected to one another.
And I mean, obviously, you've got the Treasury, obviously we have the IMF, OECD have talked about the need for a more comprehensive capital gains tax. I think for a while there was talk about tax switch, but I think too now, looking ahead to an ageing population, the pressure on health and that, whether there just is talk about broadening the tax base to actually take in more tax?
Well, see, I think there's still a lot of water to flow under the bridge between now and the next election. Nicola Willis has been talking about new revenue measures as a way of balancing the budget, but she doesn't seem to have told anybody what those new revenue measures might be. That's new revenue could be new taxes. It could be new fees, levies. There's all sorts of things that she could be contemplating in that space. Till we know what that is, I think it's very hard for us to nail down exactly what we would do, because it may well be that, if she comes up with new revenue measures that we agree with, we'd want to keep those.
We had that group of economists write to the Prime Minister and essentially saying government spending cuts were just making the recession worse and it wasn't addressing the broader economic issues the country faced. Did you generally agree with the...
I did generally agree with it. I think the main thrust of their argument, which seems to be lost on this government, is that there is a relationship between economic growth and whether the government's fiscal policy is expansionary or contractionary. They have a contractionary fiscal policy, and at a time when the economy is also contracting, and so they're making that worse. So I think the economist's point was a really well-made one, that government scaling back its investment in things like school buildings, new hospital builds, even transport projects where they've scaled back the spending on those areas, building new state houses. Government cutting back spending in those areas has actually hurt the economy. So there's a relationship between government debt, government surplus and economic growth. And if the government is ultimately slowing economic growth through its actions, then it's making the deficit and the debt problems for the government worse.
But is it just a question of how much though? Because, in your last year, Grant Robertson was looking at 1 to 2% sort of cuts in government spending across departments. Do you accept that the argument that there needs to be fiscal control and better fiscal management?
Of course, your government needs to be disciplined in its budgeting. Government needs to be disciplined in getting value for money for every dollar that it spends on behalf of New Zealanders. So yes, of course, we should always be looking at areas where we can make savings and where we can redirect funding. We should always be very conscientious about that, recognising that it's public money that we are spending on behalf of all New Zealanders. But what this government are doing is cutting without any regard for the flow-on consequences of that. We're seeing a health system that's sort of really under a lot of pressure, and the government not making the investments that are required to give us the sort of healthcare that New Zealanders want to see in the future. But they're also making some silly decisions. So they're reducing funding on preventative healthcare, when actually that's exactly what we should be focused on. If you want fewer people in emergency departments, if you want fewer people needing elective surgeries, focus on keeping people healthier in the first place.
Look, obviously capital gains tax comes up repeatedly, and although some people too have talked about a wealth tax. Is it your view, though, that you want to get that policy work done and dusted next year so that you have a kind of full year running into the election where you can explain your policy to the public?
I think if you're going to campaign on a different tax system, then you do need to do that work before you can announce anything. You do need to do that well in advance of an election so that you can work all of the issues through. You can identify any weaknesses and what you might have come up with. You can consult with the experts and so on. So I do think we need to make sure that we do that next year, so that when election rolls around, everyone knows what to expect from a Labor government.
But that will also include, because I think you've talked about this before, a different fiscal approach in terms of whether you look at debt to GDP ratios, those sorts of things, and whether you changed what has been previous Labor policy on that?
Well, I think Ganesh Nana last week made it the really good point that we cannot just think about government debt alone without thinking about the nation's debt. If all government's doing is transferring debt from government to individual households and the country's overall debt is growing, are we really better off? Actually, most households would probably think that they're worse off because they're more in debt than they were before. So I think we have to think about how we reduce the nation's debt, how do we increase the nation's income. Those are things that we should be focused on as a country, not just the part of it that relates directly to government.
And all that comes down to productivity. So is there work going on what sort of initiatives can be used to lift productivity?
It comes down to productivity, but also the nature of our economy. So at the moment, we still have a lot of our eggs in a small number of baskets. If we want to, have greater economic growth, which was driven by productivity, we do need to diversify New Zealand's economy. This is not new. We've been talking about this for the last 30 or 40 years, but we've got to really bring a sense of urgency to that because the world is changing so fast now that if we don't pick up the pace, we'll just get left behind. So, AI is driving a huge amount of change. It's going to drive a huge amount of displacement for working people. We've got to have answers to that. We've got to have retraining opportunities available for those people who need to retrain. We've actually got to focus on supporting those businesses who are in that new part of the economy, with real growth potential. We've got to look at diversifying our exports. I think our primary sector does an amazing job and actually is incredibly productive relative to other primary sectors around the world. But if we want more productivity as a country, we're going to need to be productive in other areas than just primary produce.
Investing in infrastructure is also seen as crucial to lifting productivity. And I know that Labor seems to be taking a much more bipartisan approach with the government over that. How do you see that in terms of trying to forge some agreement with the government over that general approach to infrastructure investment?
Well, I think what this government did in the first few months in office was absolutely reckless, which is basically put everything on hold just because it wasn't them that started it. We didn't do that in 2017. So if you look at some of the big infrastructure projects that started during their previous tenure in government, things like Transmission Gully, we continued those on and we made sure that they were finished. Some of the school projects that I inherited as Minister of Education, we made sure we finished them. And actually, we did a lot more.
But you did cancel some roads of national significance that they had in train, although work hadn't started.
Exactly, the work hadn't started.
Yeah.
They came in and they put paused on a whole lot of stuff that was already underway. And I think that was just reckless. So I've said that we won't do that. But what we do need to do as a country is get our planning, our consenting, our design processes much, much further into the future, preparing much further into the future so that when governments change, if government priorities change, it doesn't grind everything to a halt. If you've got a menu of options in terms of the infrastructure projects that you might want to fund, it doesn't matter if government priorities change because you're still keeping that pipeline full. What's happened in the last year is the building and construction sector has experienced this massive downturn, in part driven by the fact that the current government came in and said, we don't want to do that stuff the previous government were going to do, but they weren't ready to implement the stuff that they wanted to do, and so everyone else is just left sitting around twiddling their thumbs. 12,000 jobs have gone from the building and construction sector since the election. That's remarkable in just a 1-year period. That could have been avoided.
To support our award-winning independent journalism, subscribe to nbr.co.nz.